Everybody, this is lesson 9, using libraries and frameworks. So up until this point, we've kind of gone over the basics and the fundamentals of HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and then I think the past two lessons were recaps as well as kind of going over some modern JavaScript and making sure that we understand the difference between vars versus constant let, etc., etc. So today we're going to be talking a little bit about using frameworks and using libraries, what that means. And let me pull up my notes here to make sure that I don't miss anything on this topic, because some of this stuff is some pretty old notes. Just bear with me here. Functions, references, where is it at? Introduction. Okay, got it. Alright, so the very, very first thing that we're going to talk about is actually something that I used to ask as an interview question when I worked at AT&T and I used to interview new developers. I would ask, what is the difference between a library and a framework? Because it could get pretty confusing. So we're going to start by talking about that and talking about what the difference is. So basically, when you're looking at either a framework or a library, in both cases, let me pull up a Firefox browser here so we can kind of talk about. So as we already know, we'll talk about JavaScript first, right? But this applies to just about every language. So in JavaScript, let me open one of our example files. I'll just open this one. Okay, that's fine. It doesn't really matter because I'm just going to open the console real quick. So we've gone over how we can write a function, right? So function, this is a function. Let me make this bigger. How do I make this bigger again? I forgot. Just bear with me here. I forgot how to make this bigger. Is it Control Alt, Control Shift, Alt Shift? Nope, nothing's working. I don't remember how to make the console thing bigger here. Is this like too small for you, Nora, or can you see okay?
I can see it.
Okay. I kind of bothering me now because I know it's like Control plus. No, there it is. It's just Control plus. Okay, I got it. So like function, this is a function, and then you have your function, and your function does something, right? This does stuff. So think of a library or a framework as basically a collection of pre-written functions for you to use. That's essentially what it is. But typically there's going to be some classes as well. We haven't gone over classes yet. This is something that we're still going to go over. But just a very quick introduction to what a class is. In JavaScript, a class is essentially when you group up a collection of variables, functions, etc. Right? Is you put it all in a group and you give it a name, you have a class. That's technically what a class is. So libraries are going to have classes, it's going to have functions, it's going to have predefined variables that you can use. It's all basically created from normal JavaScript. So like, let's just say, for example, you're working on a calculator application, and for every calculator you're going to for every, like, say you want to have a function called function addition, and this is the function that's going to take your first number and your second number, and is going to return your the sum of both of those two numbers, right? Kind of like this. So as you would expect, if you do addition 1 2, you get 3, because we're just adding what you sent to this, and whatever value you give it, you're gonna get that. So a way to think of a so say, for instance, if we had some kind of library that was like a math library, maybe this library comes with these functions predefined for you. So when you're including this library into your project, you don't have to create an addition function. It already has one that you can use, and it'll have a bunch of things that you can use. So that's basically what a library and a framework accomplish. Now, to go back to the original question, what is the difference between a library and a framework? So a library will give you, like we just talked about, a list of things that you, well, not a list, but a collection of things that you can use as you please. But with a library, you can kind of write your code however you want. Basically, you're still you're using their reusable functions and variables and classes or whatever, but you're still applying the code to your project however you want. Where a framework is a little more opinionated, and opinionated is the word that's used in the industry, but it kind of makes sense. Because basically what it means is a framework isn't just about using a function that they provide. A framework is also about doing something in a very specific way, and a lot of times with frameworks that is the only way that it'll work. So let's go over an example. So a very popular, very commonly used framework for CSS is called Bootstrap. So let's create, like, we're gonna actually go ahead and create like a brand new document here, just so I can kind of show this example. So I'm going to make a new file, and I'm just going to call it lib frameworks.html. So Bootstrap, now just to be clarify, a framework is technically always going to be a library as well, right? But not every library is going to be a framework. Framework is a library, but not, but libraries aren't always frameworks. So again, libraries you use however you want to use. There's really no documentation or any guide or any specification of how you're supposed to use it, where a framework is. So different frameworks will be more opinionated than others. Sometimes a framework will be like, this has to be done this way, but all these other things you can kind of do however you want. There's always a degree of liberty with any framework based on how well you understand the language. And we're going to get into specific frameworks down the road. Like, we have a whole entire lesson that's going to be just about Ember, and Ember is a JavaScript framework. But for today, I'm just going to talk about some of the basic ones, like Bootstrap, which we're going to go over right now, and some other like basic libraries and frameworks to kind of help anybody who's trying to work on something. It's important to understand that you don't always have to create everything from scratch. And as a matter of fact, nowadays in the industry, nobody really does. Like, if you're working on like something that you need to like show a chart, for example, on your web page or your application or whatever you're doing, it's very uncommon nowadays for somebody to literally create a whole entire charting system in JavaScript from scratch. There's a ton of libraries you can use for that, and we're going to go over some libraries. But let's start with the CSS example for Bootstrap, right? So we're going to title this Bootstrap, and here, like, we're not going to actually do anything here yet, but then we're going to talk about how do you include a library into your project. Well, if this is a normal HTML project, this is not using NPM or anything like that, and we're going to cover NPM in a future session. But so here's one way. Like, you can either you can download the file, include it in your project, and list it. So kind of think about how we would if we created a JavaScript file and a CSS file. We can, make sure that it's in our project, and then we just reference it like here, right? If we're linking the CSS file, we know how to do that because we've gone over this in previous lessons. But another option is to just use a public CDN. So very quickly, I'll cover what's a CDN. Maybe you guys never heard of that before. So CDN is a content delivery network. I believe that's what it stands for. Let me make sure. CDN stands for it doesn't say. Yeah, I was correct. Content delivery network. That's what it means. And basically it's just public, well, it's not always public, but it's basically servers where you can point to where these files are, and there's like a whole entire load balancing system to make sure that, so say for instance somebody in England is trying to visit your web page, the CDN is going to feed them the file from a server that's closer to them. So it's not all kind of coming from one place. So the CDN will have these files available to anybody, and it'll deliver them pretty quickly. So that's CDNs are something that it's more on how you set up your web page. We're not going to get into it on any of these lessons, but if you're trying to use like a framework like Bootstrap, for instance, you can say Bootstrap CDN, and Bootstrap's website itself. So there's a couple. So getbootstrap.com. You can look it over here. So this is a link to how you can include the JavaScript files and the CSS files. And notice that this href here, stackpath.bootstrap.cdn, so this is pointing to the Bootstrap CDN, where you can just link it from your website and you don't have to go and download the file. You can still download the file if you wish to, or you can just copy and paste that into your project. So I'm going to copy this link. So this is the CSS file for Bootstrap, but Bootstrap also comes with some JavaScript. We're actually not going to worry about the JavaScript, right? Because JavaScript for Bootstrap is dependent on Jquery, and that's one of the reasons why there are quite a few companies moving away from Bootstrap, because Bootstrap relies on Jquery. Jquery is a JavaScript library, so you're basically having a framework that requires you to use this library. So that kind of goes back to what I was talking about, how frameworks is very opinionated and it expects you to do things a certain way, right? Now, you can use Bootstrap CSS framework without having the JavaScript part of it. They kind of complement each other, so you're going to lose some features by using just the CSS. But for the purposes that we're going to go over here today, just the CSS is enough. And I'm hoping that this makes sense. If anybody has any questions, let me know, like now before we move on. Just go ahead and shout it out, but I'll keep going for now, right? So we're not going to include any of the JavaScript files for Bootstrap. We're just going to include the CSS. So first, let's kind of like look at what this CSS file looks like, right? So this is the link to the CSS file, and obviously we're not going to be able to read any of this because this is a minified file. Usually you'll see the .min.css. Now normally you'll be able to just remove the .min and you'll see the unminified file. So that's what we're looking at right now. So this is, as you can see, essentially all this is just a whole bunch of JavaScript class styles and default styles, and it's just a whole bunch of styles as you would make by yourself if you were trying to style your web page, but this is already pre-made styles for you. And now let's talk a little bit about how to use Bootstrap and why it's so good and why so many people use it. So for instance, and again, this is a framework, so you have to do it this way. Like, there is no other way that it will work. So say for instance you want to use like a Bootstrap Grid, and before I go ahead and just code it from scratch, I can kind of look it up here just so I can show you what that means. A Bootstrap Grid system right there. So this is like a good example. So this teaches you how to do it, but I'm gonna go over that on my own here, but I'm just trying to kind of find an example. So here you can kind of see how this stuff is laid out like this, right? So here you have kind of like a table where you have 1 row and 2 columns. Here you have 1 row and 3 columns. Here you have like a 2x2 table, and etc., etc. So that's essentially what a Bootstrap container is. So you can have a div, and if you're using the class container, and again, framework, meaning that this has to be the name of the class that you use, right? Then you can go ahead and lay out your grid inside of this container. And the way that it works with Bootstrap, and we'll go over like why it's so powerful and so important. We're gonna start by doing div class row. So again, this is another part of the Bootstrap framework. If you're going to have rows, kind of like if you're writing an HTML table, your TRs are your rows. For Bootstrap, you're going to have the class called row, and then within this class, now you can have new divs. Let me go ahead and make this bigger as well. How do I make it bigger here? I think there we go. Make this bigger as well. So this would be like, for instance, call 12. Okay, and I'll explain this in a sec. Div. So I'm gonna put this is my column. Save. I'm going to use inline styles just to kind of simplify this process. So I'm going to say background color. I'm going to use a color coding system to help like visualize what I'm doing here so you guys can see it. So I'm going to go ahead and open my lib framework HTML. Now we have this div. Now notice that automatically my div class 12 got styled in a way where it took up like all this width of the web page, right? So the way that a Bootstrap system works is 12 is your maximum number. So if you think about the full width, 12 is the maximum number, and Bootstrap by default is kind of centering this div on the page just like this. So say I wanted to split that in half and make it 2 columns, I can make another div and they're both going to be 6 instead. 6 plus 6 is 12, so that covers my full length, but I'm going to make this one green instead. So now if I refresh, you have green on the left, red on the right. Now I didn't have to go ahead and add any styling to any of this to get it to look like this, because this is just already all done by the Bootstrap framework, right? So again, if I wanted to split this 6 into 2, I can go ahead and just copy this and make this 3, this one 3. Now let's make this one yellow. And this is going to go and split that like that. Now, why is this a powerful tool? This is not only just creating it like this, but like say for instance we were looking at this page in on a mobile device, it splits it for that as well. So all of that media query code that you would have to write to change how your page will look depending on what device you're looking at, Bootstrap is kind of doing it automatically for you already. See, so this is why Bootstrap is such a powerful tool. Now, if you don't like if you have like a large monitor and you're trying to design a web page that you're trying to design something for a larger span, right? Like, you want your whole entire page for 12 to be like a larger width. I believe, and I'm trying to remember off the top of my head, that it would be LG call 12. I could be wrong. I might have to look that up, but let's just try it real quick and see what happens. So if you're doing LG, no, that's not correct. Let me check over here. Small, large. Okay, I had it reversed, but it's called -LG. My bad. It's the opposite. Call is always the first thing, and then you specify your size, and then you specify how much of that 12 you're taking. And you can go from 1 to 12. You just gotta remember, like, you evenly distribute it so that in the end you have 12. I hope that makes sense. Let me know if it doesn't. So if you use LG instead, now your whole width takes like a bigger portion, and then there's also extra large as well. So you can also do extra large, and extra large will take like an even larger portion of your screen, right? This didn't change anything here, but like now if you go and look at your style for your container, you notice that you have this max width in your grid system. This is all coming directly from the Bootstrap framework, right? You didn't have to code any of this. If you wanted to make a change to it, you could write CSS on your end. So like I can go ahead, let's just say you have your own CSS file that overrides this, and you wanted to make the width 100%, for example, of your page. You can say max width. You can make that number a little bigger, but it's going to be max width for container. So you can override, I wrote that wrong, you can override your container style, container, and although you're using Bootstrap to style your page however you want, you can still override. I must be referencing something wrong here because it's not changing it. Container, but you can go ahead and you can override your Bootstrap styles with your own style if you wish to do that. And I'm not sure why this is not working right now. I'm doing something wrong here, but that is There you go. I don't know. I must have written container wrong or something. I don't know. But there it is. Now I was able to override that and change the max width to something else that I wanted to do there, right? You know, you can kind of make that however you want to take 100% of the page. You can make it 100% of the page, but you're not going to lose the way that Bootstrap will organize your rows for you. You know, and you can kind of go down and you can nest it however you want. So say like inside of this red one here, you wanted to have like a whole new container, right, that is nested. It'll actually work as well. So like here I can say div class container, and then inside of this container I'm gonna, let me go ahead and give it like a style height like 400 pixels so you can see it a little better. And now I'm gonna say div class row, and then in this row I'm gonna have a div class call 6. I'm just gonna do half and half, and this is all it is, right? 6. Here I'm gonna do style background color pink, and then I'll do another one and I'll make the color for this one, running out of colors, blue. That didn't work. Let's see what I'm missing here. So div class container style height, div class row pink. Let me put some content in them. Okay, they didn't have any content in them, and that's why they weren't showing up. And I didn't give them like a height or anything like that, but there you go. That's inside. Notice that all this padding, right? Like all these styles are default Bootstrap style. So without, obviously this doesn't look like a good web page, right? So let's just quickly look at some Bootstrap designs on Google, right? So Bootstrap designs, we'll just look at Google Images real quick, and you can kind of see, you know, and again, you don't necessarily need Bootstrap to do this, but if you look at all these web pages here, these are all web pages designed using the Bootstrap Grid. So like this is a good example right here, and I use Bootstrap for everything that I do. So if we go ahead and pull up like our URLC designing.com, the way that I'm able to list all of these little names here and make sure that everything works properly, we can take a very quick look at the, whoops, wrong button, I meant to do F12. Like, so if you look, like for example, Top Gun takes up that whole row. That's because for her I used column small 12, and then for all the other ones they all are column small 3, so they only take up, you know, a quarter of that 12, so that's why they all fit into 4. And everything really in this page from top to bottom is using the Bootstrap Grid layout. So that's why if we look at this in a mobile, or a mobile, I don't know why I keep saying that, if we look at this in a mobile version, it kind of scales pretty nicely. And if you like change it to like a smaller size screen, you know, you're going to be able to scroll through. So if you're pulling URLC on your phone, you're going to be able to scroll through just fine. This YouTube video is probably the only thing that doesn't properly fit here. Everything else is fine, right? Like you can scroll through all the way to the bottom, and because it's all using Bootstrap, everything scales very, very nicely and kind of perfectly kind of fits in there. And that's all because Bootstrap kind of handles that on its own. So that's an example of Bootstrap. If you're interested in using Bootstrap for your own projects, I recommend using this. Where is it? Bootstrap. I mean, if you can find YouTube videos, all kinds of things. I don't want to get into like too much detail about using a framework, because in the end of the day, you understand the fundamentals of CSS. It's just important to understand that what a framework does and what Bootstrap does is create a lot of styles for you. Now, another major difference between a framework and a library is although you do have to learn how to use both, a library is you can kind of look at reference and be like, what part of this do I want to use? Where if you're looking at a framework, you're also having to kind of like learn exactly how to use it step by step, because there is like a right and a wrong way of doing it, right? Like for instance, if I put like this column outside of my row, it's not going to work, That's kind of like not how it works with library. If with libraries you can kind of use whatever you want. If it's wrong, it's because your JavaScript is wrong. Nothing to do with the library specifically. So I hope that distinction makes sense. So let's talk about another CSS framework real quick. And I don't want to get too deep into it. So I'm going to just kind of open one of my files here. So I have this URL. Since we're looking at URLC examples, we'll look at my URLC overlay. But we're not going to look at anything on the browser. We're just going to open up a SCSS file, which is, so SCSS is basically me using the Sass framework. Now, if you don't know what Sass is, well, it's basically another CSS framework, but quite different than Bootstrap. It's not, so this is a pre-compiler. That's what it is. Technically, it's not really a framework or a library. It's more of a pre-compiler, but some people classify it as a library or a framework. So I'll explain what it means. If you see how I did this, it looks like CSS, right? This is all looks like CSS, but I'm doing something that you can't do with normal CSS. I'm nesting this code. So like, notice how this is referencing an element that has the ID of dashboard, and then I'm listing the styles for that, right? And then nested inside, so notice we haven't closed this yet, but inside of it I'm listing styles for anything that has the class of P1 or P2, and then inside of that I'm listing classes for something. You can't do this in normal CSS. If you're trying to do something like this in normal CSS, you have to write something like dashboard.p1 image, right? So this would give you the image for P1, and if you're trying to also include P2, then you have to do comma dashboard P2 image. So, and just to get these two styles here, right? And then if you want this style here, it'll look just like this. You can do dashboard, and you can have this style like that. But then if you want the styles that goes in just P1 and P2, then you need to do you need to go ahead and do dashboard P1, dashboard P2, and we learned about this in our normal CSS lessons, right? But we didn't talk about Sass, and this is, so basically if you look at what I've done here, right, these lines from here to here, this is equivalent. This is what the CSS way of writing it, and then in Sass you can simply just write this instead. Now, what's actually happening is, and why this is called a pre-compiler is, so Sass is not unlike Jquery or Bootstrap. Sass is not something that you can just include in your project and link a CSS file. It doesn't work like that. Sass, unfortunately, if you're just doing a normal web project, you're not going to be able to use Sass. Sass is something that you can use with NPM, or you can use with anything that's going to build out your project and is compatible with Sass. Because essentially what happens is you write your code like this in Sass, but then when it builds your page, it'll actually convert this code to this code over here. But what that does is it makes it easier for you to manage and write your projects, so that when you export your project, it'll export all these files. So like I have all of these separate files. So notice like I have this app.scss here. This is an Ember application, and we're gonna get more into Ember applications in the future. But basically here, I'm importing all these other files that are here. Oh my god, my thing's covering everything here. So all these other files have their own styles, right? But then in the end, when I build my project, all of these classes are going to just be exported into one huge minified CSS file, so the browser reads it a lot faster than you would when it would otherwise read it, and it'll basically convert all of this syntax to normal CSS syntax. But as you can imagine, being able to nest elements inside of elements like this saves you a whole lot of time, and it's a lot easier and it's a lot cleaner to write your code that way. That's why I recommend using Sass for any time you can. Anytime you're doing an npm project or anything that you can build out your CSS, I would use Sass for it instead of just using normal CSS. Another thing you can do with Sass is you can assign variables. Like you can say, this is how it works. Like you say like set primary, and then you can do like ff000, which is red, right? Let me confirm that that's the right syntax. Assign variable as CSS. It is. No, I was wrong. So it's actually a lot simpler than that. There's no set. It's just primary colon, and then you put the value like that, just like that, right? And then because you define this primary variable, anytime you want to use that color, you can just go ahead and plug it in, like using @primary where you're going to use it. And in the end, when it converts it all to CSS, it'll just replace your variable with whatever it is all over your code, and the browser will know how to interpret that properly, right? So hopefully that makes sense. And that's basically, I mean, there's more to Sass that I'm probably forgetting, but if you're interested in learning more about the features of Sass, you can go and just look up, the Sass guides, etc. But one thing about Sass that's important to also know, and I'll explain it here, is there is classic Sass and there's SCSS. Those are two very different things, really. And I know that's a little confusing, but if you look at the difference here, right, I'm kind of clicking back and forth. It looks somewhat the same, but Sass is a little more annoying to work with because your indentation is actually part of how you're supposed to code things. So like if you like miss a space or miss whatever, it's not gonna compile properly. And this was like the first version, really, when Sass came out. That's how you would write it, and then eventually it allowed for SCSS files, which is literally just CSS syntax, just how you would write CSS, but you can do these things that we were just talking about, like creating variables or nesting elements, etc., etc. So that's, and here you can kind of see, like it kind of talks about all the different things in Sass. Sasslang.com right there would be the URL if you want to read more into it, and if you want to use it for your projects, I would definitely recommend it. There's, by the way, let me just be clear, there are a ton of frameworks and libraries out there. So within our sessions, I'm only going to discuss and introduce the ones that I use. With all my experience in the industry, there's a reason why I only use the ones I use today. I've tried so many. I'm not saying that the ones that I use are always the best. There's definitely some newer stuff out there that I haven't even looked into as far as frameworks and libraries go. The industry is always developing. There's always new libraries out there. There's always new frameworks out there. So I try to stay with the curve. I try to keep my technology, if you will, cutting edge. But sometimes when you're so used to something, it's kind of like if you don't see the benefit of switching to something entirely new when you already are used to something you already know. If there's no like obvious huge benefit to doing it, then there's no point in doing it. That's my outtake on it, right? Because if I was trying to keep every single project that I ever worked on using the most up to date and what's considered quote unquote the best framework or library out there, no project would ever get done, because that's all you would do is just consistently try to upgrade your code to use the new best thing out there according to what everybody thinks, right? And each framework evolves. Like Bootstrap isn't just one thing that doesn't change. Bootstrap is always under development. So like if we go to like the official Bootstrap website right now, Bootstrap is in version 5, right? So like there's always updates to Bootstrap and changes to Bootstrap. So version 5 has features that version 4 doesn't have, and 4 has features that version 3 doesn't have, and so on and so forth. And as we go along, these things get better and easier to use. At least that's the goal, right? It's not always the case, but that's the goal for all these libraries and frameworks. They're always trying to improve. And in the end of the day, the people working on these libraries and frameworks that are used in the development industry by a bunch of people are really just developers as well, and they do this to make their jobs easier and share it to make everybody else's job easier. Some people get paid for it. There are licenses that go along with it, but if you're a developer working a single application, you are free to use it. It's only if you're in the enterprise level that you have to start paying for these licenses, etc., to use some of these frameworks and some of these libraries. But it's actually very inexpensive even at that level, because some of it are open source, so there is no licensing or anything like that you need to worry about at all. So anyway, let me check my list here. I think I covered what I wanted to cover as far as Bootstrap and Sass goes. So let's talk about a JavaScript library. So one library that I'm going to quickly mention, but I'm not going to get into, is Jquery. Jquery is going to forever, well, I'm not going to say forever, but for a long time, it's going to be considered the most powerful JavaScript library ever made. Jquery was so powerful that nowadays JavaScript itself, like the core JavaScript language, does things just about the same way that Jquery had written all this functionality to allow you to do. We're not going to use Jquery on anything that we do, like for me or within these sessions or these lessons, because nowadays there's just about nothing that you can do with Jquery that you can't just do with vanilla JavaScript just as easily. Maybe you'll have like an extra line or two, but Jquery is no longer the faster option. Jquery was amazing back when it was like a battle of trying to get your JavaScript code to work for every different browser. Like when you worked on a web page and you had some JavaScript code that, like, you say, like, you're trying to submit a form, but your form is very fancy and uses some like live validation or whatever. You may have had to write a code for it to work on Firefox, and then you have to slightly change your code for it to work on Chrome, and you have to slightly change your code for it to work on Internet Explorer because of compatibility issues. So Jquery was the one that say, like, well, you can use our function to do this, and our function on the background is going to handle all the differences for these different browsers. Sorry about that, my phone's ringing over here. Should have put it on mute. So that is what Jquery was kind of created for. And Jquery was amazing for a really long time. I mean, it still is. There's still so many projects using Jquery. I feel like I have slightly talked about Jquery in a previous lesson before. Maybe I did. Maybe it's just all in my head. But so Jquery is a library, and we don't use it anymore because nowadays there's just no point in using it. Vanilla JavaScript is powerful enough that you really don't need Jquery anymore. So we're not going to go over it, but there are tons of JavaScript libraries that you might use. So let's look at chart.js. Okay, we were just talking earlier about charts. If you're trying to set up like a chart on your webpage, literally whatever kind of chart you have in mind, whether it's a line graph, whether it's a bar, whether it's, whatever. Like one of our Dynamic project is BTC Hue, which looks like it's down right now. I haven't done anything in BTC Hue in a while. But BTC Hue is like a crypto project, and we have like this chart to show like the live Bitcoin price, and it's under development right now. But we're using chart.js library to draw up those charts. And like here, so this is a library specifically made for you to populate any chart that you want. And it's flexible enough that you can style these charts however you want, and you can illustrate any kind of data that you want. Then as far as like how would you go about using something like this in your project, well, every library will have some kind of documentation for you to use, right? So anytime you're trying to use a library, you want to go to their main page and just like, usually there's like a getting started wiki or something like that, right? So like here it's very simple, like literally just these two things will give you a chart. You will like include the script on your page. Let me see if I can do it real quick here. If we run into issues, we'll probably just skip it, but I'll see if I can very quickly do it. So here you have the CDN, right, for chart.js. Again, you can download the script and include it in your project if you want, or you could just link it to their public CDN. We're gonna get rid of all this crap that we did here, and we're just gonna say canvas ID my chart, just like that, just like the example, right? So I'm just gonna paste that in there, save. Let's see what else you need, and then you have to include the configuration for it. And I think this is so. Yeah, so this is how you would initiate your chart. You create the configuration and then you initiate your chart, right? So we're just gonna go ahead and copy the script over here and put it on the bottom under the canvas. Now notice that I'm referencing on the dorsal new false. Thank you for the follow, buddy. I really appreciate that. So we're going to go ahead and just kind of paste it. Now notice that this is using some old syntax, right? We talked about not using var anymore, so I'm going to change that to const my chart equals new chart. Document.getElement.id gets this element here. So if you wanted to change the name here to be like, you know, my chart test, you can do that. You just got to make sure that you reference it properly. So this is the ID that we're trying to get, and then config is your configuration. Now we don't have a config variable, so let's create it, which is going to copy theirs, right? Const config blah blah blah. So this just basically means that this is a line chart, and the data would be, you know, what the data that you're feeding into your chart would be, and the options would be what your options would be. We don't have any data. I don't think they have sample data here either. They do. Okay, so let's use their sample data. We're going to copy their sample data and their sample labels, and we're just going to use that, right? Just because we're just trying to test this out. So their labels are January, so it's like an array of months, it seems, and then your data just has the labels in them, and then it has these data sets. And we save. I know that my indentation here is pretty bad, but I'm just kind of trying to rush through this real quick. So now if we go ahead and refresh our page, there's our chart, right? So this is our chart in our page that we just created just by copying their getting started guide. Now say we wanted to change this to, I don't even know if this is correct, I'm just guessing, right? So maybe I wanted it to be a bar graph instead. I just changed the type. There it is, bar graph. If you wanted it to be, I don't know what the different types are off the top of my head, but it's that simple, right? You made this chart. You can go to their documentation and check to see like what kind, well, this is the API, but you can go and check to see what are the different types of charts that you have. Installation, integration, usage. This doesn't talk about that. Chart types, there you go. So you have line chart, bar chart, radar chart, you know, all that, and it tells you like, so type radar, that's how you would use a radar chart instead. You literally just change that value, and their code would handle all this for you. You don't have to worry about how that's done. And I know that with chart.js you can also go and restyle your charts as well. Now this exists for so many things, like anything that you can think of that you think is like a common use, like charts or sometimes even animate. There are libraries for just about anything you can imagine that you can just go through and include in your project, where you don't have to kind of code all this from scratch. Because imagine having to code all of this from scratch. That would be a nightmare. Like, that's not, I mean, some projects will do it. It really depends on the project and how badly you need it to be different than what's out there, and how much you don't want to use open source or third-party code, right? But so Chart.js is yet another big library that you can use. We talked about Jquery already. Understanding the out, we talked about that a little bit. So in my notes here I have understanding the output of libraries and frameworks, and just to kind of quickly reiterate, it means like more kind of like Sass, right? The end result is going to be CSS, even though the way that you're writing it is not going to be the way that you see it when it's all said and done. It's going to convert it to your classic CSS syntax. And then we have, let's see what else I have on this list. Okay, so then there's Ember, and we're not going to get into Ember today. And we're actually past the hour too, so we're going to wrap. I feel like we didn't cover a whole lot in this lesson because we actually didn't go over anything specific. But the point of this lesson was to just really discuss what are libraries, what are frameworks, how do you use them, why do we use them, etc. And I think we accomplished that. So if we have questions here, let me know. Like, just go ahead and cut me off and let me know if you have questions, and I'll try to answer them as best as I can. But we'll start wrapping this up just by kind of talking a little bit about Ember, even though we're not going to get into Ember, right? So what is Ember? And there's a lot of competition for Ember. There's a lot of frameworks similar to Ember. And there's the Angulars, there's React, and I'm not going to say that Ember is the most popular one, because it's definitely not. In my personal opinion, Ember is the best framework for web development if you're trying to make like an application that has different routes, etc. And by routes, I mean like, for instance, if you, okay, I'll just use URLC an example. So say URLC was not a single page, and instead of having just this one single page, we had separate, like, so trailer would go to URLC.com/trailer, but it'll like take you to a different page, right? That would be a different route, and so on and so forth. So that's what routes mean. It's just like different pages that you would navigate to within your application. We're gonna get into like the reason why I think that Ember is the best one for that is because although Ember is very heavily opinionated, if you remember what that means, it means like you have to do things a certain way, otherwise it doesn't work. I think that in the long run, that's a good thing. It's annoying at first because it's like you're essentially having to learn how to do things the Ember way. But once you get familiar with it, doing things becomes so easy. Like, I used Ember to do all of the overlays for URLC. Let me check if my URLC stream server is live right now. I don't think it is. Nope, it's not. It's not running right now. I have the server down. But all of that, like, for those who remember seeing the dashboard and the cue cards and all of that was done using Ember framework. The design was based on Bootstrap, but it was my own design. And with Ember, you can combine all of these things. And that goes into the NPM world. And we're going to wrap this up by talking about what NPM is, because on the next lesson, we're going to dive into NPM and talk about how you create a Node application. So, Node.js, let's go. Okay, it's right here, Node.js. So what is Node? Okay. So Node is basically, I guess one way to think about it is it's a JavaScript engine. The JavaScript runtime. Okay, yeah. So they describe it as Chrome's V8 JavaScript engine. That's what it is, right? So when you're opening your browser to go to a web page, like any web page that you do, your browser has the capability of reading and interpreting all this code, all the HTML, all the CSS, all the JavaScript. So Node, just like your browser, is a library for handling JavaScript code and executing and building JavaScript code. Now, the major difference is there's no visualization to Node. Like, Node is, I guess you could kind of think of it, Node runs on a console. So like let me just, quick introduction, I'll open up my my server here and let me know if this is visible, right? So this is using a shell, right? If you're doing this on Windows, you would just be using your command prompt instead to run Node. So you would just, Windows R CMD, you open your command prompt. If you have Node installed in your Windows machine, this is where you would run it. And we are going to set up environments for our developers here, students on this DynamicD course, to be able to access the DynamicD server and work on this stuff if you want. But I still recommend installing Node locally if you want to work with it, because that way you can work offline. You don't need the internet to work on Node projects. Like, I mean, technically you do if you are trying to download a new package, but you can, once you have all that stuff locally, you don't have to have internet connection to work on this stuff. So basically, I already have Node installed on my server, right? So I'm just gonna create like a dummy directory. I'm just gonna so this is essentially making a folder, right? mkdir in Linux. I'm just making a directory here. I'm just gonna call it node test. Okay, so I'm gonna cd into it. I'm just basically opening that folder. I'm not trying, this lesson is not about Linux usage. but in the command prompt, you'll still have to do this. You'll still have to know how to navigate to your project. So I want to start this node project, and I'm going to run a command called npm init. Now npm is basically, it stands for Node Package Manager, and we'll go over that in more detail on the next lesson. But notice here it's asking me what the name is. By default, it'll name it after the folder, so it's test, and I'm just gonna hit enter for everything, right? So like the version 1.00, there's no description, there's no whatever, no license, everything is the way it is. So if I look at my directory, all I have now is this file called package.json, right? And if I look at what package.json looks like, it's a JSON file, which if you look at it, it looks a lot like a JavaScript object, right? But this is a JSON file. We talked about JSON on our very first lesson, so if you guys remember that, it's just a way to collect information into a structure that you can put in a file and then work with easily. And all this is information about my application. So in npm, all we're gonna do to finalize this is say I wanted to install Bootstrap, right? So in a normal page, we kind of talked about how we would go grab that CDN and paste the link over here. In Node, you can literally just say npm install save Bootstrap, and it'll automatically go and find the Bootstrap library in the npm repository, and it'll install it to our project. Now, if you look at your package.json, we've installed Bootstrap as a dependency to our project right there. So when we build out our project and you do an npm install, and we're gonna cover npm in more detail in the near future, in the next lesson. But now that I've installed my npm, now I have this folder in there called node modules. And if I go inside of my node modules folder, if you're doing this on Windows, it'll be easier for you to open up your folder and visualize all this stuff. Bootstrap is in there. So all those Bootstrap files that we were just kind of going over, right? The JavaScript, like you see the CSS for it, it's all there. It's all part of my project now. And now I can go and create node test, and then here I can go and create like a index.javascript file, and I can start coding JavaScript. Now you can set up your environment where you're still using NetBeans or whatever IDE you're using to code to write your code. But if I want to include Bootstrap, all I have to do is just say require Bootstrap, and this in Node, this would be the equivalent of copying this stuff over, and you're just requiring it, and then you go on about writing your JavaScript code, right? If you're going to have a function or a variable name, a const this var equals blah 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 blah, you just carry on with your JavaScript code. And then to run your code in npm, it would be like node dot, and we're going to talk about that in the future. And I think at one point I showed like a very quick example of Node. But so now Ember is this whole huge thing that runs on Node, right? So if I want to make an Ember project, this is the last, this is how we're going to wrap this up, I promise. I'm going to go ahead and delete this Node test that I made over here. So if we're going to run an Ember project, just ignore what I'm doing here. I'm just kind of going to a different directory. So you would just type Ember new. You have to install Ember, and Ember is another npm package. You have to install Ember with Node. But then once you have Ember installed, you would just type Ember new my app. We're gonna call it my app, right? Now Ember is gonna go ahead and build out this brand new vanilla app for you. It takes a little bit. And if it takes too long, we're gonna cut it off short. But we'll give it a second. And okay, that wasn't too bad. So it created all these files, right? Because again, Ember is a framework. So Ember already puts all of these Ember files in place. It structures your project for you automatically, and it builds it all out with all. So Ember itself, and I'll go ahead and show you real quick. We're gonna learn a lot about looking at Git repositories and stuff like that through this process, but we'll dive into that a little bit more on the next lesson. So if I go to Ember CLI GitHub, so Ember is actually Ember output. Okay, So Ember is basically, these are all the files that it's going to create for your project automatically, as you saw over here. But Ember itself, if you remember what I just showed you with package.json, has a bunch of npm dependencies that it has to install. So that's why this build process takes a little bit, because it's literally going through this package.json, it's downloading all these npm packages from the internet, and it's installing it onto your project so that you can go ahead and work on it. npm.org, it's npmjs.com. So this is the official npm webpage, and like, you know, this is where all of the packages that are available to download and do with are listed. There's, like I said, there are probably millions of packages available for you to use on your project. So this is all stuff built by other people. There's a lot of open source stuff out there, all code developed by other people that you can literally just reuse within your own project, right? Making things a whole lot easier. Okay, so now my Ember application is ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and navigate to my folder, which is called my app. Now I'm inside of my folder, and these is a lot of files, right? So like, I haven't even done anything yet, right? But this is basically the structure of my Ember project so far. It's a whole bunch of files, right? Now to run Ember, I'm just going to say Ember S, and it'll go ahead and build out the application and run it for me, where I could go access my app and test it out. And we're almost done. We're just going to get to the point that I can access my Ember app here and show it to you guys. And then the next session will go more deeper into npm and Ember, and we're going to kind of have a major introduction to Ember, because any projects that you guys want to work on from this point forward will probably be an Ember project. And we're going to be working on a few things, like Nora's going to get a couple of assignments for the new URLC webpage that we got to build out. So that's exciting. I hope you're excited about that. It's all going to be on Ember, so we're going to be able to actually do some real work there. So notice here it says serving on localhost 4200. Now you could go ahead and access your page. Now the way I have it set up, it's on my server, so it's a different IP for me. But normally you can literally just copy and paste this localhost 4200 if you're running it on your own machine, and then you go to the port, and there's our Ember application. It's basically just a default Ember thing. Congratulations, you made it. You've officially spun your very first Ember app, blah, 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 blah. And from here, like, it has guides or whatever. But essentially what's happening here is, if you look at the Ember structure, and we're going to go ahead and kill the server for now. But, well, not for now, but we're going to kill it, because I'm going to delete this. Inside of your app folder here, you have your templates folder. And inside of your template folder, you have your application HBS, and we're going to get into HBS down the road tomorrow, or not tomorrow, next lesson. So if you look at the application file, this is all that's happening here. Okay, this is what the file looks like. It just says welcome page and outlet, and this technically generates this. How? Well, I killed the server, so you can't see it. But what we saw before, right? The little hamster with the sign and all that stuff is generated by just technically just this line of code and this line of code, because the other stuff are comments that don't actually do anything. We're going to talk a lot more about Ember structure, and a lot of this web development lesson from here on out is going to very Emberified, if you will, because within Ember we're still going to be touching HTML, we're still going to be messing with JavaScript, we're still going to be doing CSS, but we're going to learn how to do these things within the Ember framework way, within the Ember structure. So that way there's a whole lot less things that you need to do, and then a whole lot less things that you need to worry about. But I am glad to know that you guys, at least at this point, have all the fundamentals down for how a browser reads a web page and all that. That was important to go over first before getting into Ember, because now when Ember is doing all of this all this magic for us behind the scenes, it feels less like magic once you're able to wrap your head and understand exactly what Ember is doing for you. And some of our next lessons are going to be primarily about that. But we're going to wrap it up here. We've gone an hour 20 minutes just discussing different frameworks and different libraries. And even within Ember, we'll still use Bootstrap. We can still use jQuery even though we won't. All of these libraries and frameworks that we're talking about, it's not like you have to pick one and you can only use that one. You can combine them. And with Ember, you can use pretty much any of them, right? And we will use plenty of them for our projects. So we'll wrap it up here. I hope that you guys were able to get anything out of this. Nora, since you are the only one live in chat here with us tonight, do you have any questions before we close this out for good?
No, you actually answered questions with this one, because when I was doing a lot of the projects on my own, they were using bootstraps, and I was like, I don't know what the fuck this is, so I'm just going to leave that out. And then I was able to like eventually get it to where I wanted it to without using it. But knowing now that using it would have probably saved me hours and hours of figuring out how to do it on my own.
Yeah, like because now you get an idea.
Like, I was looking at code for jQuery, and I'm like, why isn't this? I'm trying to copy it. I'm like, this doesn't look right. I've never seen this. Stone has never showed this to us. Like, no, this is not. This is. I have to do this a different way. This isn't working. I can eventually get around the jQuery and do it in JavaScript way, but. Yeah. It'll make it a lot easier.
Yeah, but at least you understand why you were having issues with that. Yeah, that explains, because now you understand why. Like you were seeing documentation like that, and you were seeing examples like that of things that you didn't really know how to use.
Yeah, because I was seeing like just the single $sign without like the apostrophe, the squiggly bracket, the way that you were referencing strings and stuff in a function. Yeah. And in labeling stuff, and I'm like, okay, maybe they're just leaving stuff out. Like, no, why would they leave stuff out? They're not just leaving stuff out. That's stupid.
No, it's because they have a jQuery library in their project. Yeah, but now you know, and like we're gonna be avoiding jQuery. It's hard to get away from jQuery examples. Like sometimes you'll
all over. It's all when I do like JavaScript projects, it's all over.
Yeah, jQuery dominated web development with JavaScript for years and years and years, and we've reached a time where it's no longer recommended to use jQuery, but
even
it took a long
Reddit
time.
Reddit answers will reference through jQuery. They won't even give you like the regular syntax. They'll just use jQuery. Yeah. I'm like, I don't know this. I can't do this, and then I'll recognize the word, and I'm like, okay, so with like if it would be something like .click or something, I'm like, all right, well I know this is like add event listener, click, blah blah blah, run function, but it's just the long way.
Right. Yeah. Right. I mean, it is technically the long way, but that is if you're including a jQuery package in your project and using the jQuery syntax in the background, jQuery is doing that anyway. Ultimately, right? It's just that for a lot of things, it's actually a lot more happening, making your application a lot slower. That it's not worth using it anymore. It's as a developer, I spent probably over 6 or 7 years working with jQuery. So I was to a point where I knew jQuery like the back of my hand. So when I was working in AT&T and we were having meetings with people talking about, oh, we shouldn't be writing this in jQuery anymore, I was one of those people like, oh, no, I don't give a shit. I'm going to keep writing jQuery. And it was hard to transition away from it. And I think that a lot of people in the industry still feel that way to this day. It's really difficult to transition away from something that you've grown so used to, especially when in a lot of ways it's like simpler to write it. Right, but at the end of the day, if you look at the benchmarks and you compare, I had to literally do this myself. I compared a couple of like a jQuery for each to a vanilla JavaScript map, which one runs faster, and there is no contest. Like the vanilla version is so much more effective that like you can't deny that.
Go into the library. It doesn't have to go into it, and then find it, pull it. When you can just do the same thing.
And not to mention that by including the library in your project, you are including so much code that jQuery has available for you to write that you're not really needing. Exactly, you're using like less than 2% of all of that for your project. So it's it's just not recommended anymore. But I mean, like it's better to learn without it at this point, because that's where things are shifting. Like if people were still using jQuery on projects to this day, then we would be talking about like how to write this in jQuery and why you don't do it the normal way, because that's how it used to be before. Before, to do something the normal way, you literally have to create a whole entire JavaScript file with many functions to replace like one jQuery call. It's just not like that anymore though, so not worth it. But it seems like you're catching up pretty good, and I'm happy with that. But we're gonna go ahead and go offline here, wrap this up. Thank you guys again for the time, and we are going offline.